Hello and welcome to today's video about how to get info from an Excel file and input them in an accounting system using UI automation. In today's video, we will extract invoices info from this Excel file. Invoice number, customer name, service name, invoice amount, and create customer invoices in Wave, a free accounting platform for small businesses. Let's proceed. First we rename the initial transition and the initial sequence. In this sequence we will define the control identifiers of the Wave login page, email, password, and the sign-in button. First add a start process activity in order to access the Wave sign-in page. The process name is mseg.exe and the password is the page's URL. Both values must be quoted. Next, add a wait for control activity. Its purpose is to make sure the page is loaded before starting to input the credentials. Let's define the control identifier that robot has to wait. Select the entire sign-in page. The UI browser page appears, where we need to rename and fine-tune the control identifier by replacing Windows caption and text property with wildcards. As a best practice, use highlight control to make sure the control identifier was defined and fine-tuned correctly. Change the timeout value from 5000 milliseconds to 8000, meaning 8 seconds, in case the sign page loads slowly. Next we add a set text activity to input the login. The control identifier is the email text field from the sign-in page. Like in the previous case, rename the control identifier, fine-tune it and test it with highlight control. Create a string variable, login wave, and set the default value the login account. Then set the newly created variable in the value parameter of set text. Add another set text activity to input the password. The control identifier is the password text field from the sign-in page. Like in the previous case, rename the control identifier, fine-tune it and test it with highlight control. Create a string variable, password wave, and set the password as default value. Then set the newly created variable in the value parameter of set text. Let's test the first 4 actions. And it works just fine. Now let's add a click control activity to press the sign-in button once the credentials are input. For this, let's define the control identifier, rename and fine-tune it, and also test it with highlight control. Let's test one more time the entire sequence. And it works just fine. Let's add another wait for control activity in order the robot to know when it successfully logged in Wave. For this, we define the control identifier dashboard, rename and fine-tune it, and also test it with highlight control. Let's celebrate the sign-in by adding a show message box activity. Now let's move back to the canvas. Add a new sequence. Rename it Create New Invoice. Set the transition from the sequence login wave and rename the transition. Open the newly created sequence and add two click control activities. Their purpose is to navigate from dashboard to the new invoice page. For the first click control activity, the control identifier is the drop-down Create a New. Like always, we rename the control identifier, fine-tune it, and test using highlight control. The second control identifier is the option invoice from the drop-down. Let's also rename and fine-tune it. If we want to test now the control identifier, highlight control will return an error. That's because we have already ended up in the Create New Invoice page. To test properly the control identifier, we need to go back to Dashboard and remake the first click. Now it works perfectly. Let's go back to the canvas and create a new sequence. Get Excel file. Also set a transition from the previously created sequence and rename the transition. Open the new sequence and create a new string variable, source path. Add an assign value activity and set source path as input. The output is the path to the Excel file. Don't forget to double the backslash in order robot to know it's part of the string, not a meta character. Add a new variable, invoice W sheet, of type Excel document. Add a new string variable, filename, having the default value the Excel file containing invoice info. In this case, it is invoicereport.xlsx. Add a new activity, open Excel workbook, in order the robot to open invoicereport.xlsx in background to get data from it. The Excel document is the variable invoice W sheet, and the document path is source path plus filename. Now create two integer variables, number rows and row counter. Set the default value 1 for the second variable. Add a new assign value activity, where number rows is the input. The output is invoicewsheet.getWorksheet 1.dimension.end.row, which returns the last row of the first sheet of invoicereport.xlsx that has content. Let's add a new message box activity to celebrate this project milestone. Let's go back to the project canvas. Add a new sequence. Set the transition from Get Excel file to it, and rename it Get and Parse Excel Data. Open the sequence and add 5 string variables: invoice number, customer name, invoice date, service name, invoice amount. Add a get cell value activity aimed to capture the original invoice number from the Excel report. Set invoice number as output, invoice W sheet as Excel document, row counter as the Excel row index and 1 is the column index. In Wave, the invoice number field is an integer and accepts values like 1, 2 instead of INV000001 or INV000002. To solve this, add an assign value activity and set the variable invoice number as integer. We will use the replace method in the output. Practically we replace INV dash and as many zeros as there are width. Add a new get cell value activity aimed to capture the customer name from the Excel report. Set invoice W sheet as Excel document, row counter as the Excel row index, and 2 as the Excel column index. The output is the string variable customer name. Add a new get cell value activity aimed to capture the invoice date from the Excel report. Set invoice W sheet as Excel document, row counter as the Excel row index, and 3 as the Excel column index. The output is the string variable invoice date. Let's add an assign value activity in order to convert the invoice date from DDMMYYYY format, e.g. September 7, 2020, to YYYYMMDD, the format accepted by Wave's invoice date field. Set the string variable invoice date as input. The output is datetime.parse, invoicedate.trim.toString, YYYYMMDD. Let's deconstruct it. We parse a string variable as a datetime1, use the trim method to remove the spaces from September 7, 2020, and then change the format into YYYYMMDD. Add a new get cell value activity aimed to capture the name of service invoiced from the Excel report. Set service name as output, invoice W sheet as Excel document, row counter as the Excel row index, and 6 is the column index. Now add the last get cell value activity to capture the amount to be invoiced from the Excel report. Set invoice amount as output, invoice W sheet as Excel document, row counter as the Excel row index, and 7 is the column index. Let's add one more assign value activity to convert the invoice amount from its European format thousands separator point and decimal separator comma into the format accepted by Wave, the North American format. Set the string invoice amount as input. In the output we do string manipulation using substring and replace to remove the currency sign and convert the invoice amount format. Let's add a new message box activity to celebrate the new milestone in our automation project. The message box will display each invoice amount extracted and converted. We use environment.newLine to add each new invoice amount on a new line. Now let's go back to the main canvas and add a new sequence where the magic will happen to input the invoice data in the Create New Invoice page of Wave. Rename the new sequence Input Invoice Data, set a transition from the previously created sequence to it, and rename it. Open the newly created sequence and add a wait for control activity. Its purpose is to program the robot to wait the control identifier at a customer or any other control from the Create New Invoice page to load before starting to fill in invoice data. Define the control identifier, rename it, fine-tune it, and then list it using highlight control. Once the robot is sure the Add a Customer button is there, let's add a click control activity that will access it. Given the fact that Add a Customer button has already been defined as control identifier, we can just set it in the click control activity. Let's give time to the list of customers and the search text field to fully load by adding a wait activity. We can let the standard value of the time parameter to 1000 milliseconds, meaning 1 second. Next step is to add a set text activity in order to input the customer name in the search text field. Define the control identifier customer name search text field, rename it, fine-tune it, and test using the highlight control feature. Set the string variable customer name as value to be set. Once typing the customer name in the search text field, the list reduced to only one value. The easiest way to select the value is by using a click point. Use the Microsoft Phi tool Inspect UI to get the XY coordinates of the point where you would like the robot to click. Keep in mind that the coordinates I set would work in your automation project only if you have a laptop screen of 15.6 plus the sale and layout settings 100% and 1920x 1080. Once customer is selected, some changes happen in the page, so better add another wait activity. Set the wait time 2 seconds. Add a new set text activity to input the invoice number. Add the string variable invoice number as value to be set. Add a new set text activity to input the invoice date. Add the string variable invoice date as value to be set. Add a new click control activity that will press the button Add New Item. To increase the automation robustness, press exactly on the plus button, rather than entire Add New Item section. Once click on Add a New Item, the list of our services will be displayed. To give time the fields to be fully loaded, let's add another wait activity of 1 second. Let's add a new click control activity that will press on the Create a New Item button. Once click on Create New Item, the Invoice Line Item section will appear. To make sure Robot will start to input the service name and amount at the right time, add a new Wait for Control activity. Add a new set text activity to input the service name. Select the control identifier that was already defined in the previous activity. The value to be input is stored in the string variable service name. Add a new set text activity to input the invoice amount. Add a new click control activity to press the Save and Continue button once all the fields are filled in. Now let's move back to the main sequence again. Add another sequence and rename it. Create another invoice. Set a transition from the previous sequence to it and rename it. Open the newly created sequence, and add an assign value activity to increase the value of row counter once the current Excel row is fully processed. Let's add a message box to notify that robot is moving to the next Excel row. Let's add a new wait for control activity that will pause the robot until the invoice overview page is loaded. Define the button Create New Invoice as the control to be checked. Add a click control activity to press on the already defined Create New Invoice control identifier. Go back to the main canvas and set a transition from Create Another Invoice back to the Get and Parse Excel sequence and rename the transition. Add a new sequence and rename it End Sequence. Set a transition from the sequence input invoice data to the end sequence and rename the transition. Add a message box activity to notify the automation reached the end. Add also one more click control activity to go to the invoice list. Let's again move to the main sequence. As you can see, there are two transitions leaving from the sequence input invoice data. According to the state machine convention, only one transition can be without condition. Therefore, let's define the conditions for both transitions. If the row counter is still smaller than the total number of rows, the robot will proceed to the new row. If the row counter is equal or bigger than total number of rows, the robot will follow the end sequence. We are all set, so let's run the entire automation project. The robot access Microsoft Edge. Input credentials and press Sign In. Navigate to the new invoice page. The first invoice was created, and we received the notification that robot is moving to the second invoice. The second invoice was created successfully in draft, and now the robot notify us this was the last invoice. Thank you for watching. Visit our documentation page for more use cases.